Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today, we're exploring the fascinating and, let's be honest, often elusive world of Muriel Spark. Our conversation is prompted by a recent article in The Economist reviewing Frances Wilson's new biography, Electric Spark. What's truly remarkable about Spark is, well, she was a writer whose books were exquisitely spare, incredibly precise, yet her personal archives are just staggering, 60 meters long. I mean, that's apparently equivalent to an airport control tower. It genuinely makes you wonder, how does someone who seemingly left such a vast, preserved paper trail still remain so profoundly mysterious?
It is a fantastic paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really quite something. Spark cultivated this opacity, this intricate game of hide and seek with her readers and definitely with her biographers. So much so that even a determined new biography like Wilson's, which delves deeply into Spark's own self-curated paper trail, finds it genuinely challenging to pierce that veil. The Economist article touches on this quite accurately, I think, noting how Wilson's book limits its story to 1957, partly because Spark's documentation becomes this labyrinth of self-mythologizing after her breakthrough novel. It's almost as if she was, writing her own biography as she lived it, crafting a narrative.
Right. Carefully controlled. So our mission today, then, is to unpack not just what the Economist article says about Muriel Spark, but to look closely at what it highlights, maybe what it glosses over or even missed, and what that tells us, more broadly, about how we actually understand complex figures like Spark. We're trying to get beyond just the summary, digging into those nuances that reveal the electric charge beneath her famed rubber gloves approach to feelings. That metaphor really sticks, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
So to start, let's consider what the Economist article does capture accurately from Wilson's biography. When you read the review, what key insights about Spark's life and work really stood out?
Well, it certainly correctly identifies Electric Spark as the first major biography since Martin Stannard's comprehensive two-volume work back in 2009. And there has been a significant wave of renewed interest in Spark lately, especially with the National Library of Scotland digitizing her immense archive, that 60 meters you mentioned, making it accessible. The article accurately points out Wilson's focus on Spark's self-curated paper trail and that striking contrast between her exquisitely spare novels, these really lean, precise works, and the sheer Tuscany Tower volume of drafts and notes that went into creating them. It also highlights Spark's famously cultivated opacity, her deliberate elusiveness, which, as you said, effectively foils even the most determined biographers trying to pin her down. It's like she left behind this vast treasure trove of information, but encrypted it with her own personality.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the article really brings to life some of those truly Sparkian moments, doesn't it? The eccentric characters that populated her early life. I mean, people with names that sound straight out of fiction, like Princess Marie Bonaparte or Lee Francis Howell when Sackville, the Montmorency von Henry. You couldn't make it up.
You really couldn't.
And then the dramatic events unfolding around her husband being, described as a lunatic who literally tried to jump out of a window, or a colleague turning out to be a spy. It paints such a vivid picture of a life that feels just as dramatic and unpredictable as her own fiction. You read it and think, this can't possibly be real.
It's true. Her life often reads like one of her own novels, fills with the unexpected, the sharply observed, and characters who seem larger than life. And the Economist article does highlight Spark's own quote about intending, quote, practice the arts of pretense and counterfeit on the reader, which is absolutely central, I think, to understanding her approach, both to her fiction and her own life story. She truly made it challenging for biographers, even trying to control her own narrative through an autobiography, which, as the article points out, largely failed because she said she could only write a book when she knew how it's going to end.
Right, which is tricky for a life still being lived.
Exactly. An open-ended narrative that just defies easy closure.
Okay, now, this next point from The Economist, it touches on a really contentious aspect of Spark's reputation. It leans heavily on a particular critique. Her alleged emotional chilliness, that detachment, famously encapsulated by the phrase she approached feeling only with rubber gloves. The article even anchors this claim in her difficult decision to leave her son in southern Rhodesia. So when we look deeper, what does this allegation truly mean? How accurate is that framing?
Well, this raises a really important question, doesn't it? About how we interpret a writer's personal choices within, the broader context of their life. Well, The Economist repeats an old charge, one that's been leveled against Spark for a long time. Wilson's new material actually provides crucial context that, it really changes that narrative. It reveals Spark fled a demonstrably violent husband, someone who had threatened both her and the child. Her decision to leave her son wasn't an act of indifference or cold abandonment as it's often portrayed. It was a temporary refuge arranged with relatives in, frankly, a desperate situation. Sadly, this very difficult, painful situation was later weaponized by her grown son in the press, distorting the narrative into this idea of cold indifference.
Which then became the accepted story.
Precisely. A widely accepted but deeply flawed interpretation of her character.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests that the Economist review, maybe by just reiterating this unchallenged claim, risks reproducing these sort of mid-century societal expectations that mothers must stay no matter the danger.
Right. And what's particularly fascinating, maybe ironic, is that Spark's own fiction routinely satirized exactly this kind of societal bias, these rigid expectations placed on women. So, judging her detachment as a personal failing, rather than seeing it perhaps as a stylistic choice or even a survival choice, it seems to miss a crucial part of her story, and indeed her artistic intention. It's almost as if the very critique leveled against her is something she herself would have put under the microscope in her novels.
Okay, that's a really important corrective. Now, the Economist article also touches on Stark avoiding feminist labels. And it treats her 1954 conversion to Catholicism almost as a historical curio, a quirky detail. But are these really minor details? Or are there larger, more significant contexts maybe missing from the Economist appraisal that profoundly shaped her work and worldview?
Oh, there are significant omissions, absolutely. Spark's conversion to Catholicism, for instance, it's far from a mere curio. It's not just a biographical footnote. Critics like Martin Stannard and even more recent Catholic Herald reassessments argue it profoundly underpins her fascination with predestination, with authorial omniscience, that idea of a knowing, godlike narrator.
Right.
And with the moral mechanics of satire. Her faith really did seem to rewire her aesthetics. The fact that Wilson's book stops at the comforters necessarily means it stops at the very moment her faith crystallized her governing worldview and started to profoundly influence her writing.
So the timing of the book's cutoff point is itself significant.
It could be. One might certainly ask if this chosen cutoff date means the book concludes just as Spark's most defining philosophical and artistic framework was truly solidifying.
And what about the feminist angle? The Economist notes she avoided the label, but then, as you said, it just lets the question rest, doesn't explore the implications.
Exactly. And Guardian and Observer critics of Wilson's book emphasized that Spark's cool, distancing narrators, far from being emotionally deficient, they actually interrogated gendered violence and restrictive roles for women long before it became, mainstream literary subject matter, by primarily measuring warmth or sentimentality rather than focusing on her structural insight or thematic concerns. The Economist risks judging a stylistic choice her deliberate detachment as a personal failing, when in reality it might have been a powerful artistic and intellectual stance, a deliberate, effective way to dissect societal norms without the sentimentality that might have blunted her sharp observations.
That's a powerful reframing. And speaking of how Spark crafted her image, let's unpack this fascinating paradox of her archives. The National Library notes she preserved every scrap expressly to defend what she called objective truth. But Wilson, in her biography, recasts this as an act of narrative control, suggesting Spark stockpiled evidence precisely so she could later rearrange it, almost like scenes in a novel. So what does this all mean for biography itself, when the subject is so intentional, so actively involved in shaping their own narrative, even for posterity?
Well, this raises a huge question, really. It challenges the very premise of literary biography. If the subject is both a dedicated hoarder of documents and simultaneously an enemy of explanation, as Spark seemed to be publicly, then what truly constitutes truth in a biographical context? It forces us to ask, what is the biographer's role when the subject actively crafts their own narrative, even in their personal papers, seemingly with future biographers in mind? And, given that Spark's early life was already quite thoroughly anatomized by Martin Stannard's authorized biography and her own curriculum vitae, one might reasonably ask if Wilson's more psychoanalytic reading of Spark's radio receiver imagination, her unique way of absorbing the world, truly delivers new critical insight. Or if it perhaps just repackages familiar anecdotes in stylish prose, as some critics have suggested. It forces us to be incredibly critical of the biographical approach itself.
So how can we recenter this debate then, and maybe reevaluate Spark's deliberate impersonality, moving beyond just seeing rubber gloves as a flaw or a sign of deficiency? How can we see it as something more complex?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, I think we need to weigh her deliberate impersonality against her historical circumstances, her incredibly unique life journey. Here was a Scottish Jewish woman who dramatically reinvented herself across colonial Africa, post-war London, Catholic Rome. She was constantly negotiating, navigating complex gender roles, rigid class structures, religious fault lines, none of which really rewarded overt sentiment or emotional vulnerability or public confession.
So for her, perhaps emotional display was a kind of luxury she couldn't afford or maybe chose not to indulge.
That's one way to think about it. What looks like poidir, that emotional coolness, that perceived detachment in her private life, often becomes, in her fiction, a disciplined and highly effective refusal of melodrama. It's a strategic choice, not a deficit.
Oh, okay.
A refusal of melodrama. Precisely. This refusal allows her satirical structure to expose cruelty, hypocrisy, the absurdities of human behavior far more clinically, more effectively than maybe confession or overt emotional display ever could. Her coolness wasn't a character flaw or an emotional deficiency. It was an aesthetic and ethical strategy. And it's a strategy that continues to challenge biographers, critics, and even casual readers like you listening now to look beyond the perceived gloves for the true electric charge underneath her brilliant, incisive prose.
It asks us to engage differently.
Exactly, on a deeper intellectual level, perhaps, rather than purely an emotional one.
What a fascinating exploration into the life and art of Muriel Spark. We've really seen how a critical interpretation can go beyond just summary, challenging the framing, revealing deeper, more nuanced truths about an artist's choices and their impact.
Indeed. Spark's deliberate impersonality wasn't a lack of feeling, I don't think. It was a powerful, chosen strategy that allowed her to dissect the human condition with this razor-sharp precision, almost surgical clarity. It's a real testament to how an artist's very style, even when it appears detached, can be their most profound form of engagement with the world.
So maybe we leave you with this thought. How many other artists or writers or public figures might we be misunderstanding by judging their warmth or their conformity to conventional emotional expression? Could their true power, their real insight, lie precisely in their detachment, in their unique perspective, or even their refusal to conform to our expectations of sentiment? What might we discover if we look beyond the surface for that hidden electric charge and other stories that seem initially cold or distant? Until next time.